All right, good morning and welcome to the Extranet User Manager webinar on Extranets in SharePoint and Office 365. My name is Peter Carson. I'm the president of Envision IT and Extranet User Manager. I'm going to be presenting for about the next hour or so. I'm also a SharePoint MVP and a partner seller with Microsoft Canada. We're going to post a copy of this deck up on our website, and we'll send a link out to all attendees and registrants as well, so you'll have all my contact information in there. We also have Dinesh Sohan, who's our Director of Products, and Logan Guest, who is our salesperson. So if you've got any questions around licensing, trials, demos, Logan's your go-to guy from that point of view. So a quick agenda that we want to cover off today. We're going to start with a brief introduction to Extranets, just level set everybody in terms of what an extranet is and what that looks like. Then we'll get into authentication in SharePoint, talk about features in Extranet User Manager, licensing, and we'll take you through some demos. Apologies, working from home today, so got a little bit of background noise with some excitement with the dog. All right. So let's start with just what is an extranet. So a website, or an extranet is a website accessible to users outside of the corporate network. It allows organizations to share information and collaborate with their customers, their partners, and their vendors. All right, so we're talking about what is an extranet. It is a secure website that can be delivered in a number of different ways. It could be an extension of your public-facing website, a secure portion of your corporate intranet, or as a standalone extranet. So what are some examples of extranet users? Well, they could be members if you're, say, a not-for-profit organization. They could be customers or vendors or suppliers. It could be volunteers. Maybe you're a charitable organization. Board of directors, either for a private or a public organization. Citizens from a government point of view, researchers, tenants, partners. There's lots of different examples. And really, extranets apply to any type of organization and have a lot of value across all of those. So when we're talking about building out an extranet, we need to think about, first off, who's coming into the extranet. What are the target audiences that you want to focus on? We rattled off a long list of potentials there. You may want to target just one group or several different groups as you're launching your extranet out. So then you have to think about, well, does everybody see the same information? Obviously, if you've got multiple different groups of users, maybe you're building a customer portal. It's not appropriate to show customer A, customer B's information. We do need to have separation and security from that point of view. Is there some sort of member database that we need to interface into? Maybe you're using Dynamic CRM or Salesforce, or you've got an ERP system, a Blackbaud from a charitable donation tracking point of view. We can certainly talk about how we integrate in with those other member databases. Is your extranet invitation only, or can people self-register? Do you want to have a link on your website that people can come to discover it and register and go through an approval process? Or do you know exactly who you're going to be inviting in? Let's take the board of directors, for example. You're not going to have random people requesting to be on your board of directors extranet site. You know who those people are, and you can just invite them in from there. But if it is self-registration, you do need to think about, what does that approval process look like? Is there just one group of approvers, or does it depend on maybe what part of the extranet they're asking for access to? How do we delegate that out throughout the organization? And is it just the extranet, the SharePoint on-premises or Office 365 that they're going to be accessing? Or are there other systems that they need to come into as well? Is there some sort of single sign-on that we need to be aware of? So these are all considerations, and it's part of the conversation as we're working with a new client, understanding what that looks like. So let's talk technology for a minute. We're a Microsoft Gold partner. We're very focused, obviously, on the Microsoft stack, and we target our solution to either on-premises SharePoint or Office 365 primarily. But it's not exclusive to that, and I'll talk about single sign-on into other systems a little bit later through the session as well. We certainly leverage Microsoft Azure from a cloud point of view, and obviously we have our own technology in the Extranet User Manager itself. So I'm going to open up a quick poll. I want to get a sense from people what they're using today in terms of what version of SharePoint are they currently on. So let me just open that poll up. Okay, so I'm going to give you, about a minute or so. Just you can pick off more than one. If you're using both cloud and on-premises, maybe you've got Office 365 and SharePoint 2013, for example. Check both of those off. I want to get a sense of who's using what from that point of view, and I can tailor some of the conversations from there as well. And I'll share the results out so people can see how they fit in from that point of view. All right, I'll give you another 10 seconds or so to finish that off, and then we'll close that out. Okay, so let's share the results of that out just so everybody can see that. So vast majority actually using Office 365. So actually, as we're going through, maybe I'll put a little more focus on the Azure AD B2B and Office 365 side of things. Certainly a good spectrum of people on 2016, 2013, and 2010 as well, all of which we support. The only one that we don't is the MOS 2007 or WSS 3.0. So a couple folks still on that platform level. Really, I would strongly encourage you to move to a more modern platform. That's actually going end of life in the next 4 months or so from a Microsoft support point of view. So best to move off of that platform. All right, and there's one more quick poll that I want to do here. This will be the last one, I promise. So I want to get a sense of how people are using SharePoint today. So regardless of which version you're on, are you doing internal collaboration with that? Are you publishing out your intranet? Two very common scenarios from a SharePoint point of view. Do you already have an extranet today on your SharePoint, or are you running your public-facing website on SharePoint? So again, I'll give you another 20, 30 seconds just to answer that back, and then we'll share it with the group. All right, so let me close that out and share. So not surprisingly, overwhelmingly, folks are using SharePoint both from an internal collaboration and from an intranet perspective, which are the two most common workloads for SharePoint, and it's really what it's best known for. Almost half, though, using it from an extranet point of view. Nobody from a public-facing website. We're seeing less and less of that, although we've got some interesting ideas around Azure websites that I'll touch briefly on, but would look for an upcoming webinar on that topic as well, in terms of how you can kind of combine your SharePoint on premises or SharePoint online with an Azure public-facing website as a nice combination there. So let me hide that, come back to our main deck. So from here, we want to talk about how do people get into the extranet. This idea of authentication. It is a secure site, so they need to typically provide a username and a password. What does that look like, and how does that work? Let's start with the on-premises side. Windows authentication is how most people are used to authenticating to SharePoint on-premises. They open a browser, they're already logged into their company's Active Directory, and it just takes them into SharePoint. They don't actually see the authentication, but behind the scenes, it's happening through that Windows authentication. Some of our competitors use what's called form-based authentication. Our product was built this way a number of years back. We've moved away from that to the next model, which is the federated identity. The advantage being that it's much less deeply coupled into SharePoint itself. When you want to set up forms-based authentication, there's a lot of configuration you need to do on the SharePoint side in order to get that going. It's not ideal from a support point of view. With Federation, it's much simpler. It just run a PowerShell script, you show up in central admin, and away you go from there. And basically SharePoint becomes what's called a relying party through Extranet User Manager, which is the trusted identity provider. There's a fourth one, though, that we're only just starting to experiment with right now, the idea of using Azure AD B2B. And we're going to talk about B2B more from an Office 365 point of view. It stands for business to business, but it can also be used on premises through a Microsoft product called Azure Application Proxy. And basically, it's a proxy that allows you to expose your on-premises SharePoint securely out into the cloud and have people authenticate through Azure AD to that. The nice thing is while they have credentials in your Active Directory to get into your SharePoint, they don't actually realize that, and they never actually see those credentials. They don't have a password for your on-prem AD. They're simply interacting with Azure AD. So again, look for another upcoming webinar from us as we get this baked into the product and get some interesting scenarios going from that point of view. So that's from an on-premises perspective. What about from an Office 365 point of view? Well, if we start with the simplest, it's cloud identity. And what this means is that each of your users has an account in your Azure Active Directory. And ultimately, everything in Office 365 from an authentication point of view runs through Azure Active Directory. There's no integration to your on-premise systems. First things most organizations do, though, is they set up Azure AD Connect. It used to be called DirSync. And basically what it does is it takes the information from your on-premises Active Directory and it syncs it up into Azure AD in the cloud. And when users log in, they can actually use the same password that they use on their on-premises Active Directory in order to sign into Office 365. But again, this is still focused to internal users only. Then there's this idea of federation, where you're going to use an identity provider, which in Office 365 is usually Active Directory Federation Services. And the reason you use this is to provide single sign-on. That, while it's great to be able to use my same password to go to the intranet or the collaboration sites, really I don't want to see a login page at all. I just want it to happen automatically, kind of like the old world SharePoint days on premise, where I just launch the browser and I'm into my intranet or I'm into my collaboration site. That's what federation does for you. When you're inside the corporate network, it provides a single sign-on experience right through to that. Earlier versions of our product, in fact, we still have support for it, allowed us to use this model as well with Office 365. The challenge was that when we created users for external users this way, they weren't considered external from Microsoft's point of view. So you actually needed to get a license for them. We have some charitable clients that works for because they don't, they get gifted those licenses under their charitable status, but for everyone else, really the preferred approach is to use Azure AD B2B. So the idea here is it's called federated Azure AD. If your external partners have their own Azure AD, they actually use the same credentials they would use to log into their own Office 365 to come into your portal. Doesn't mean that everybody who has Office 365 has access to your portal. It just means if you invite somebody in and they already have credentials with Microsoft, they can simply use those credentials. All right. So let's talk more about that B2B scenario. We saw it as the last scenario in a couple different spots. So the advantages to it is it's very simple. Your partners are invited into your Azure AD. They use their existing account and their permissions can be managed easily from that point of view. Basically, your partners are being invited in. Your access is all secure and controlled through your own Azure AD directory. And the partners that you invite in only have access if you grant them. You can remove that access at any point in time and their access is immediately revoked. But also, if that partner leaves that partner organization, they're going to get shut down on that side and lose that account, and that basically removes access into your extranet as well. So it actually addresses one of the main concerns with extranets is when I invite people from other organizations into my site, and they no longer work for those organizations, I never find out about that, and how do I remove them out from that? So B2B really takes care of that for us. Now, they don't need to have their own Azure AD in order to use this. If they don't have an Azure AD account, Microsoft will actually create one for them, and it'll provide a simple sign-up process. They enter in their password, and it provides forgotten password reset and such, similar to what our product does, all as part of that experience. Okay, so let's talk more about B2B in Office 365. So once you've invited them into your Azure AD, basically you can grant them access to any part of your SharePoint Online. And basically they're considered external users by Microsoft, so they don't actually need an Office 365 subscription. Permissions can then be applied not only to those users individually, but they can actually be made of Azure AD groups and granted permissions through that. And then site owners can manage the membership of that group through our product, through Extranet User Manager. So it may sound a little confusing, but we'll get into some real world scenarios and give you a better sense of what that looks like. All right, so I mentioned the external users don't need to have an Office 365 account themselves. That's actually the preferred scenario, though. It's actually the simplest for them because they just simply log in with the same credentials they would use for their own Office 365. But let's say, for example, I work for an organization that's not in Office 365 and don't have an Azure AD account. Basically, what Microsoft will do is they'll create that tenant behind the scenes for you. They create their password, they provide some profile information, and later, let's say that organization does decide to move into Office 365, that tenant that was automatically created can actually be converted into a full Azure AD tenant later. The third scenario, though, is if I'm using, say, a Gmail or a Hotmail account, a consumer email account. In that scenario, you actually need to convert that account into a Microsoft account in the background. Now, obviously, if you're using Hotmail, it already is a Microsoft account, so that's fairly seamless. If your Gmail or maybe your ISP provider email from a retail email point of view, you have to go through that process of converting that to a Microsoft account. Now, Microsoft will guide you through that process as part of the sign-up. It can get a little bit confusing for those external users, depending on their savviness from a technology point of view. So just be aware. I'm actually going to only take you through the first scenario in the demo today, but I have a previous session that's specifically on Azure AD B2B, where I go deeper into each of these different scenarios. So what are some of the limitations around Azure AD B2B? Well, the idea of delegation is very important in our product. The idea that IT shouldn't be the gatekeeper of those external users, and we want to empower the business to manage their users themselves. Well, yes, you can delegate in the out-of-the-box Azure portal. That can be a little overwhelming for business users, and it's an all or nothing. Basically, you can grant them the right to manage external users, and they can manage all external users, not just their group's worth. So if you've got a larger extranet where you've got, maybe thousands of external users and lots of different groups with different business ownership for it, it's difficult to manage that delegation through there. There's also no self-registration or approval. So if it's invitation only, that can work in a smaller extranet scenario. But if you want people to be able to sign up and go through an approval and get onboarded automatically, that's not something that the out-of-the-box product provides there. Likewise, any sort of integration to other line of business systems, if we've got profile information that needs to go in, we talked about maybe CRM integration, verification as part of the approval process. Again, that integration is not there. There's also no integration to the on-premises Active Directory. So that scenario I was describing where we use the Azure application proxy to provide access to your on-premise SharePoint, for example. Maybe you're running hybrid where some of your information is SharePoint on-premises and some is in Office 365. You'd have to manually create both of those accounts and wire them together. That's something that we're actually looking to build into the product itself and to simplify that process. So let's talk more about Extranet User Manager itself. What is it, and what does that look like? So I've mentioned delegation as the number one thing from an implementation point of view, and that's one of the key features on the product. The whole idea here is to remove IT as a gatekeeper. They don't want to be the gatekeeper, and the business doesn't want them to be either. So let's make sure it's easy to delegate down to the business owners, or even potentially to the external users. That external user experience needs to be really solid too. We want to have self-registration, approvals, simple forgotten password reset, simple login. So even though there's a fair bit of complexity happening behind the hood, we want to keep that as simple as possible for both the internal and the external users. So we've built support into our Extranet User Manager product specifically for Azure Active Directory B2B. So we can provide the self-registration, the profile management, the delegation, the approval processes, and basically as you create users and groups through Extranet User Manager, they're set up automatically behind the scenes in Azure AD. Currently, we don't send the invitations in the process. We're actually about to release a version that does do that for us. But basically, the ability to brand that and maintain the user experience throughout there. And then the idea that Azure AD is going to manage the login process, and it's going to manage group membership, which is good from a governance and a permissions management point of view. So that's from a cloud Office 365. That's where most people's focus was, but I do want to talk about on-premises as well. Basically, in this scenario here, Extranet User Manager acts as what's called an identity provider. So basically, it presents the login form, it figures out what groups people belong to, and SharePoint can then decide what permissions to grant to that user from there. So it manages that whole single sign-on experience. Now, that doesn't have to be just to SharePoint. It can be to other applications as well. It's fully branded registration and login experience, and we'll talk more about the features in a minute. So what would some of those other systems look like? It could be an Azure website. I mentioned we're going to do a future webinar around how you can maintain your public website content in SharePoint and then push it to an Azure website. Very cost effective, very highly scalable way of doing a public facing website. You could have SaaS applications that you subscribe to. One of our clients uses Desire to Learn as an example. We provide single sign-on into D2L. You could have your own custom applications. Quite a number of our clients have built their own custom apps and then integrated our identity provider into that. And we can even create and update those user profiles in those other systems. Like in the Desire to Learn case, it's not enough just to log into D2L. You actually need to create a user account. So as part of our self-registration and onboarding and approval process, it creates those profiles in D2L as an example. Okay, so let's talk about the features in Extranet User Manager. So first and foremost is around brand. You don't want to see our Extranet User Manager brand on your extranet. You're going to want to see your own brand in there. So having a brand and experience is very important as part of that. That's not just the login, but the registration, the emails, basically all end user touch points and pages through there. A single sign-on, so if we're dealing with multiple systems, maybe it's hybrid on-premise SharePoint and Office 365, maybe you've got your own custom apps, you've got external SaaS providers like D2L that you're going to, users sign in once, and then as they move from system to system, they're automatically logged in. It's all securely managed through SAML tokens, which are an industry standard way of doing that. Currently done with WS-Fed, we're actually moving to a new OpenID Connect, more modern approach to doing that as part of our upcoming release as well. Simplifying that login experience. I'm going to show you this in real life in a minute, but basically the ability as somebody comes to hit the SharePoint site to decide, based on their IP address, are they coming from inside the corporate network, in which case I should just take them straight through into SharePoint, or do I need to present a login form and figure out whether their email domain is still corporate, I have to go down that path, or as an external user and they have to provide a password. So looks like a complicated diagram, but the idea is to keep that as simple as possible for both the internal and the external users. Multi-factor authentication. So if we've got a login form with a username and password, we typically use the email as a username to keep it simple for the external users. But perhaps from the privacy or security or your information, that's not sufficient. We want to do a second factor of authentication. So we actually leverage Microsoft Azure's multi-factor authentication, which can do an interactive voice call or a text message. The user needs access to that phone number or to that phone to respond to that to complete the login process before they come in. And we're smart about that. We've got customizable rules that say, if you're coming off an existing device from an existing IP, you haven't typed in a wrong password previously, you haven't done a forgotten password reset, we're going to let you write past and not do the multi-factor authentication and just do it at a higher risk point depending on the profile of that individual user. Self-registration is a big thing. Not all of our clients use it, but for those that do, it tends to be a fairly customized interaction. I'm showing you the Public Health Ontario one as an example here right now. So it's fully customizable, not just from a look and feel, but from the fields that are on it, from how the approval workflow works, whether there's integration into other back-end systems, how that all hangs together. So it is fully customizable. It's currently a Visual Studio project. We do provide the source code on request to clients that have purchased the product, and they can customize that themselves, or we can do that customization for them. As part of our upcoming major release that we're working on, we're actually moving to a much simpler model where there's just an HTML form talking to a backend REST API. Makes it very easy for somebody to customize that process from there. Forgotten password, if we're managing the authentication, extranet users are often infrequent. They may not remember their credentials. If you're like me, you've got lots of different accounts on different systems, providing an easy way to reset that password. So whether you're a brand new user and we're getting you your initial credentials, or you've forgotten you want to do a reset, in both cases, we don't actually send the password to you. We send a one-time use, time expiring token. You click the link, you then set your password from there. The idea being that you and only you as an external user are the only one that knows your password. We can't reverse engineer it from where we store it in the database. An administrator of the system can't set a password on behalf of somebody. It has to be done through that email process. I mentioned at the beginning when we were doing the survey, we support SharePoint 2010, 2013, 2016, and Office 365, so all of those apply. Now, even though we target SharePoint, doesn't mean that we need to be installed on the SharePoint server itself. In fact, many of our clients install on a separate small IIS server. That's basically all that we need from that point of view, and away we go from there. Delegation, I mentioned before, big deal here. The idea that IT shouldn't be managing things and we want to delegate it securely, not just internal to the business, but potentially to the external organizations themselves. And in my demo, I'll take you through a scenario of what that looks like. Adaptive design, mobile first is very important, so making sure that all of the end user pages work well on smartphones, tablets, as well as desktops. They're built using Bootstrap, so they're very responsive from that point of view. Now, you don't need to actually install the product yourself. We actually have a hosted version of the product that we host up in Azure. We have our own multi-tenant environment that we manage, and we've got a third party providing 7/24 monitoring and remediation against that. But if you do want to install, as I mentioned before, you can install it on the SharePoint server, although many of our clients choose to install it on a separate standalone IIS server. We provide multilingual support. We're a Canadian organization, so English-French was obviously the first for us. We've had clients translated into many different languages. There are resource files there, so even if we haven't translated to a particular language, that's something that you can work with us to provide that support as required. So how do you buy the product? What does the licensing look like? Well, there's two versions, and then there's two ways to deploy the product. So there's the standard and enterprise version, each of which can either be an on-premise or a hosted installation. And the only difference between standard and enterprise is the number of applications. So we don't license the number of external users. We don't license the size of your SharePoint farm, anything from that point of view. It's basically if you've got a single SharePoint farm or Office 365 that you want to interact with, that's a standard license. If you've got other custom applications or SaaS applications you want to provide single sign-on to, or maybe you want to do a hybrid between on-premises and Office 365, that would be an enterprise edition. The 8 or 13,000 is a US dollar perpetual license, so that's a pay once price, and then there's a 20% annual software assurance. That gives you updates to the product, but it also gives you rights for dev and test licenses. You don't need to purchase additional licenses for your dev and test environments. If we run it for you, it's either $850 or $1070 a month USD. That, of course, includes all your software assurance and updates and everything from that point of view, because that's a fully managed experience. All the pricing details are up on our site. Lots of different clients in different categories. We've got a number of case studies up on our site. I'll try and pull a few of those up as we go through our discussions today. Okay, so let's start with a demo in the SharePoint 2013 side of things. I know a lot of you had Office 365 checked off, but I think pretty much everybody had one of the on-premises in there as well. So this is the scenario that we're going to go through. You can actually hit this URL, it's publicly available. It's basically a SharePoint 2013 site that's exposed to the internet over SSL, so it's secure, and the top level site is anonymously available. So if I launch a new browser window here and go to that site, well, actually I was previously signed in, so let me sign out. I want to take you through the experience as an internal user coming right through there. So let me relaunch that again. Fresh browser window, not signed in. So it's got a sign in link here, or I can click this link to access the private area, which is a subsite that requires authentication. So regardless of which of those I do, it's going to challenge me for credentials. As you realize from the barking dog in the background, working from home today, so I'm not in my office. It didn't auto-detect and take me through to the site automatically from that point of view. So I need to click the staff login link here, and we're going to actually use Active Directory Federation services to log into the site. Okay, if I was in the office, I wouldn't have seen that. I'd just click the link to go into the site, and boom, I would be here. And now I'm in this /private subsite as peter@envisionit.com, which is my main corporate identity. Okay, so let's actually do something a little different here now. I'm going to open up a incognito window, and I'm going to run two different sessions. So I've already signed in as an internal user in the other one. Let me bring this one up here. Let's say I want to access the private area. It's going to bring up the login form, and I don't actually have an account yet. So I'm going to click on the link here and take you through the registration process. So I type in some user information. I'm just going to use one of my test email accounts. And I need to answer the CAPTCHA here. And go ahead and register. So this isn't actually creating an account yet. What it's doing is it's creating a pending approval user in Extranet User Manager. So if we come back into my other session here, let me actually go into the admin console. So I'll just open that up in a new tab. I'll go through the staff login on that one. And if I do a search for users here, I'll see there's my Peter Carson 2 user that's currently pending approval that I just created. Now the system's also going to generate a couple of emails, so let's have a look at those too. Now, those take a minute sometimes to come through, so while I'm waiting for that to come through, let me open up this record here. So I see all the information that the end user entered onto the system, and then I decide what do I want to do with that user. In fact, here's the email that came through to me as the approver, basically saying that Peter Carson 2 has registered, and I need to edit their record, which is basically going to take me to this same spot here to edit that user. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to move them from pending approval to active, and I'm going to put them in this EUM SharePoint group here. Let me actually copy that because I'm going to use that in a second too. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save this user. So at this point now that I've set them as an active user, it's actually going to create the actual user account for that. It's going to send a welcome email to that user with that one-time time expiring token that I talked about for this new user to set their password. So you don't have to worry about how do I get credentials out to that user. The system manages that for you. Now while we're waiting for that one to come through, let's have a little bit more of a look through here. So we were looking at users. We can see now our Peter Carson 2 user is an active user in there, ready to go. I can come back in and edit them and work with them from there. But let's also have a look at the groups that are set up in the system. And this is a key part of Extranet User Manager. So I put them into that EUM SharePoint group. So if I open up that group there, I'll see there's my Peter Carson 2. I could remove them from the group here. I could do it back on the user side. But let's actually create a net new group. So I'm going to add a new group. We'll just call it webinar. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add that user that we just added as an owner of this group. What that means is they'll be able to come into this console and manage the membership of this particular group. So we say OK there. All right, so if I come back to my email, so I just got the welcome email, and these emails are completely customizable. I'll show you how that works as well. So welcome Peter Carson 2, I need to set a password before I can access the site. So that's the time expiring token in there. Let me copy that link. And if you remember, I was using the incognito window here as my external user. I'll just paste that link in. All right, so the first thing I have to do is set a password for this account. You can define what password complexity rules you want to use on your site. We've got full complexity on there. I've set my password. I haven't actually signed in yet. So when I click on the home link here, it's going to ask me to sign in as that user and use that password that I just set. So where it takes me to is a landing page. And what this is doing is it's looking into the SharePoint site and saying, based on the credentials that you just entered, what do you have access to? I have access to the top level anonymous site, and I also have access to this private subsite as well. So let me just do a right click, open a new tab there. You saw the single sign-on flip through in the background there because I'd already signed into EUM. I didn't need to sign in again into SharePoint itself. So that's actually an example of single sign-on right there. And you can see I'm logged in as that Carson 2 user that we just created. But let's come back for a minute into the portal here. What are some of the other things that I can do here? Well, I can go to my settings page and I can update my profile information. So if I've changed my phone number, we've actually disabled the changing of email address. We support it, but a lot of our clients prefer not to allow external users to change their email since that is their username. And I can update all that information. I can have different, profile or checkboxes or things on this form, and I'll show you some examples on the client demo side. I can also change my password, so I haven't forgotten it, but for whatever reason, for security best practices, I want to change it. As long as I can enter my old password, double enter my new one, go ahead and change it from there. So let's come back into the SharePoint site. Now, Lenny and Min, let me open that in a new tab. That's where we were just working a minute ago to approve that user and put them in the group. Now you'll notice I'm actually in the admin console is that pcarson2 user that we just created. And the reason for that is, remember I created the group and I made this user an owner of that group. So basically they have the ability to search up any of the users here. Like let's say they want to use this pcarson1 account here, they can edit that user and they can make them a member of their webinar group that they own. There's other unmanaged groups like EUM SharePoint that this user doesn't own, so they can't actually manage that one. Now you might say, well, I don't want my group owners to be able to see and edit all of the external users in the system. Well, we can configure that and lock that down to say, well, they only see members of their own group, depending on the scenario. Particularly if you're going to delegate externally to external groups like we've done here, you're probably going to want to lock that down so they don't see that full suite of users. Okay. While we're in the admin console, I'm going to come back to my full administrators. When I come here, we see we've got a lot more features in here. I have the ability not just to search and add users. I can also do groups that we also looked at. We can also import users in. So if I have a bulk set of users, maybe there's 100 people I need to give access to, get them as in Excel, download the template, fill everybody in and upload it. It goes through a validation step. I hit go. And all those users get set up, they get their welcome emails, and they're into the extranet from there. So a very easy way to get things going from that point of view. I mentioned the emails are all configurable. If we look at the welcome email, for example, I can decide what my subject is, how long that token is valid for, what the body of the email looks like, and there's placeholders in here where basically mail merges happen to customize and personalize those emails. So we've got 4 different emails. There's the 2, I only showed you one of them. One goes to the approver saying somebody just registered. The other one actually goes to the person that registered, thanking them for their registration and just letting them know that they have to wait for the approval to happen. The welcome email that we just looked at, and there's also a forgotten password email. So if you've forgotten your password, you enter your email address. It's this email that gets sent out to you, much like the experience on the welcome email. Click the link with the token and go ahead and set your new password, and away you go from there. There's a number of other more technical options in here since I'm logged in as a configuration editor, but we won't cover all those for right now. Now there is I've shown you sort of the 2 ends of the spectrum, a group owner that can just manage users and a configuration editor that can do everything. There's also a group editor who doesn't see all the system configuration features, but does have the ability to search and add new groups through there. So it's pretty granular in terms of the permissions into this console here and how you delegate that access out into your external users. And all that applies whether we're talking about Azure AD B2B into Office 365 or SharePoint on-premises. In fact, I'm going to switch gears and show you that demo, but I'm actually going to use the exact same installation in order to do that. So let's come back to my deck here. So we've got a couple of client demos. I want to take you through the Office 365, and then let's circle back to this one here. So on the Office 365 side, we're going to use eumdemo.sharepoint.com. Now before I click that link, what I want to do here is go into our regular Envision IT Office 365. So you may not have seen it flash by there, but it basically went out to ADFS, said, hey, you're signed in, provided the single sign-on experience into our Office 365. So this is not the tenant that we want to demonstrate from an external point of view. This is just me as an Envision IT staff member accessing our intranet. So now if I come back to this link here, go ahead and click on that, it's now going to take me to that eumdemo.sharepoint.com site. One easy way to see are you on a SharePoint Online site or not is they all end in .sharepoint.com. So this one is envisionit.sharepoint.com. This one is eumdemo.sharepoint.com. Now it's saying, hey, I don't know who you are. I mean, you're signed into Office 365, but you don't have access to this site. So this is the experience for somebody who you haven't invited into your site. You can try logging in with a different account and such from there. Okay, so let's actually go through the process of inviting myself into this Office 365 site. So I could do a self-registration. I'm going to skip a couple of steps and just go straight to the add user. So I need to fill in my name and email. I have to provide a username. And instead of being active, we're going to set it to Azure B2B, different type of account that we're going to be creating. But we're still going to put them in that same EUM SharePoint group. And actually, we use that same group to manage permissions in our on-premises SharePoint 2013 and our Office 365. So a little bit of hybrid going on from that point of view. In fact, we could put them into the webinar group. We haven't assigned any permissions to that group, but it is there and available to us. Okay, so let me go ahead and save that. So this takes a minute. What it's going to do is Microsoft is actually going to send me the email. I mentioned we haven't got the sending the email directly from Extranet User Manager baked into the product just yet. We know how to do it. It's possible through the API. We just got a little bit of code that we need to write to support and do that. Okay. So I knew this was going to take a minute to come in from Microsoft. So what I'm going to do now is just switch back to some of our client demos here. Now you saw this one here, Public Health Ontario, when we're talking about our custom registration. So this is a public-facing website. It's actually on SharePoint 2010 still. They're looking at upgrading it to 2013 or 2016. But you can see the registration here. So this is an example of custom registration. In fact, they've simplified this. They had a more complicated one before. They've actually turned it into a two-stage process. So if I'm a general citizen registering, I just fill in my information, away I go, and I have an account, and I immediately get a welcome email and set my password and log in. It doesn't actually give me more rights to content, but now I'm a named user in the site. But let's say I'm an epidemiologist with a public health unit who needs access to some of the BI data they have behind this site, because there's actually a fair bit of rich data privately behind the site. I would then go through a second stage registration to identify that. There's an approval process around that, and away we go from there. Some of the other ones to have a look at, suppliers.kinross.com. This is a SharePoint 2013. It's actually hosted in Azure, so they've built the whole SharePoint farm in Azure. So they're not using Office 365, but they are in the cloud. Again, a fairly sophisticated registration process here. If I click on the register now, it actually takes me through a multi-step process. And the idea is that first I need to identify that I'm actually a supplier, because this portal is intended for the 6,000 suppliers around the world that work with Kinross. And that's actually integrated into their JD Edwards ERP system. So I need to validate and provide a JD Edwards number, and we integrate in through web services into their ERP as part of that process. It's taking a little while to come up. Actually, let's go back to our incognito window for a minute here. I want to take one more example. So I see that email has now come through, and I go to ocas.sharepoint.com. So another Office 365 implementation. Here, we are doing the login process. We're not using B2B on this particular one. This is an example of a charity where they actually get subscriptions for their external users, and they manage the login for that. The reason for that is that when they log into the portal site, it also provides single sign-on over into Desire to Learn that I mentioned previously. So if I want to register here, I need to fill in all of my information. Typically, I would belong to one of the the member children aid societies, and if I provided an appropriate email that matches that society, then I actually get auto-approved through there. Otherwise, I go through an approval process. So again, examples of customizations around the approval. And we push this profile information not only to Office 365, but also up to Desire to Learn. Okay, so I've got my Microsoft invitation for the one that we were doing before. I've been invited to access applications in Envision IT. So let's hit the get started. So when we take control of this, although you can customize this out of the box from Azure B2B, we're going to provide a little more flexibility around how that customization and experience happens. So I click to get started, and it already knows, because I went to my Envision IT Office 365 previously, that I'm logged in and ready to go from that point of view. It's now asking me to bring access into the eumdemo.sharepoint.com. So when I click next here, it's actually not going to take me through the sign-in process. It goes straight through into redeeming because I've already signed in. So this would be the experience if I'm using Office 365, I'm already signed into my own Office 365, and I get an invitation from somebody. It takes me right through from there. Now it does take a minute to provision that user in Azure AD and get them set up. but that'll come up shortly from that point of view. Actually, while that's going, let's just bring up one more example to have a look at. This is one of my favorites. It's another charitable organization, Boys and Girls Clubs of Canada, Canada-wide organization, so fully bilingual site in both English and French. Like Public Health Ontario, also on SharePoint 2010 still, one of our older implementations. So the public site obviously has a lot of rich anonymous content available to it, but there's also a members portal if I'm a staff or volunteer at one of the 100+ clubs across the country. If I don't already have a portal account, I can register, I can outline what's my relationship with Boys and Girls Clubs of Canada, and actually name my own approver email. So this, at first glance, might seem a little odd, but the idea is if you know somebody at your club who already has a portal account, they can vouch for you, basically. They'll get an email saying, hey, do you know Peter? Yes. Boom, I'm now in the portal, and now I can do that for somebody else, and it becomes a very organic way of building membership in the portal. Oh, something didn't quite work there. Now, sometimes we have a little grief with Azure AD B2B. Let me just close my browser out and let's start that fresh and see what that looks like. So if I go to eumdemo.sharepoint.com, we'll actually see the login experience now. So I'm going to log in with my Envision IT credentials, a worker school account. It takes me to my ADFS, which I wouldn't see if I was inside the corporate environment. No, demo gods are not shining on me. I did a dry run with this before and I used the same account, so I probably messed something up by leaving it behind in the on-premises. All right, so let's come back to our deck from here. Is there any more that we want to have a look at here? I think we've covered most of the scenarios. We've got some Office 365 and some on-premises from an example point of view. I do want to talk a bit about this. I mean, this is the example that I was mentioning previously on the idea of hosting your public-facing website in an Azure website. We haven't gone live with this yet, so unfortunately I can't share the actual client example just yet. But it's quite interesting, the ability to host up your public website here on the right-hand side very cost-effectively, on the order of a couple $100s a month, and in a very scalable way. If you need to scale that out to a large set of users, you can certainly scale up and scale out very easily in Azure. And then we use our Extranet User Manager hosted, which is also in Azure in a separate environment as part of that. And then Office 365 is used for the publishing, content authoring as part of that experience. So again, look for a less technical, more business-focused webinar coming up, kind of explaining the nuts and bolts of how this works. All right, I'm always worried about running out of time. I think I ran a little bit quick here, so I think we're actually going to give you a little bit of time back. So from a next steps point of view, I do need to update the phone numbers. We actually just switched to a VoIP system in the last month or so, and I forgot to update our decks. So when you get the link back, the presentation that you pull down will have the correct phone number, contact information in there for Logan. You can still get him at the 812-3009. It's just easier through his new direct dial number. He's on the call today. He's been answering questions as we've been going through. He's your guy to get more product information, to set up a one-on-one technical demo, or if you want to actually set up either a hosted trial or an on-premises evaluation copy, he can get that process going for you from there. Some upcoming events we're sponsoring, and I'm speaking at SharePoint Fest both in Denver and Seattle. So if you're in the Denver area and it may be beginning of June, by all means come by. And then in the early August timeframe, going to be out in Seattle for that as well. Links, again, these will all be up on the site. So the recording from today's session as well as the presentation deck will be on our extranetusermanager.com site. I've got some other links there from an Azure AD B2B point of view. We actually just published an article on the new release to general availability for Azure AD B2B. That happened just last month. So we've got some more details on that. We'll include a link to that in your package that we send out post the webinar as well. So I think that's it for slide decks for me. Logan or Amanda, I don't know if there's any questions that you guys weren't able to answer as we're going through that we want to tackle right now, or whether we want to wrap things up from that point of view. All right. Thanks, Amanda. Well, with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us. Have a great rest of your Wednesday, and look forward to hearing what your thoughts are, and if we can move forward on a trial or a demo installation, love to talk more about that. Thanks very much. Have a great day.